Thank you, Anna. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Great. My name's Tom Fikes. I'm actually Director of Research at the Action Lab. Lou Pugliese, our Managing Director at the lab, couldn't be here, so I am. But I do want to talk about who benefits from online education, access, opportunity, and student success. And I was sweating through Anne-Marie's talk, thinking I do not want to follow this talk. It's fantastic. But her quote from Stony Brook set me up perfectly. And I was hoping to find her during the break and actually get the slide to start with. But I've got something that's similar to it. It's actually that notion that online education disadvantages those who are already disadvantaged that I want to focus on today, because I think for exactly the reasons that Anne-Marie talked about in social mobility, it's one of the most important questions that we've got in front of us. So here's my plan for today. I want to talk in the abstract just for a moment about who we are, ASU, Ed Plus, and the Action Lab. So I'll give you a little bit of boilerplate on that to put this in context. I want to advance an argument, and I wish I had about 15 minutes to actually put this together. I've not presented this before, but a colleague and I are working on this for a publication. But it's an argument that it's actually a counter-argument. It's an argument that deconstructs the argument against online education. It's recently been claimed in a quote that I'll show you that online education is an engine of inequity. And I think there are some fundamental flaws in the argument, and I think the empirical data for that are still out. I hope to turn around the logical argument a little bit here in a few minutes, very quick on that, and then spend most of my time on the limited, but I think interesting empirical results that we've got. I'll talk about an online efficacy study, which has recently been completed and is out there now. I'll talk about two studies that are now in the works, ready for publication, a study on gender and ethnicity equity in online education, and a study on heterogeneous treatment effects and adaptive tutoring in college mathematics. So who we are. You've probably seen this before in some form, but I think it's worth putting up. It is our standard boilerplate for ASU's charter. And the things that I'll point out here is that our president has, I think, done a fantastic job of getting us to remember daily that we're defined by who we include, not by whom we exclude. And in particular, our success then is measured by how those whom we include succeed or don't. ASU's charter involves a number of different sorts of research and discovery of public value. The Action Lab is involved in turning that lens back at ourselves and asking, how do we do in digital teaching and learning, one of the more important aspects of our innovation in education. And then lastly, the end goal here is economic, social, cultural, and overall health of the communities that we're embedded in. Social mobility is really what we're after here. Ed Plus's mission. Ed Plus is a centralized enterprise unit within ASU. It's the umbrella over all of the digital teaching and learning enterprises. That includes, across the bottom here, our ASU Online, which I'll be talking about exclusively today. We also do research in open scale courses, which are Global Freshman Academy and some other more recent programs, partnership with Coursera. We focus on online continuing education, and then that's us over there in the corner, deep learning analytics. That's the Action Lab, so that's our goal anyway. The Action Lab is a dedicated teaching and learning laboratory. We're situated inside Ed Plus. We engage in digital teaching and learning research, learning science, cognitive science, social science focuses, with the goal specifically of enabling continuous improvement in online program, and that improvement is measured against individual student success. So that's the abstract of of who we are, and here is the backdrop of the argument that I want to advance. Digital teaching and learning as an engine of equity. I got into this business because after 20 years on the faculty as a psychologist and social neuroscientist, I was ready for a career change. Didn't know what I was going to do. I was doing some consulting work in experimental economic games, and encountered ASU, Ed Plus, Lou Pugliese, and Michael Crow, and heard what they were up to, and I thought, this is exactly what I want to be involved in. But I wanted to be involved in it because over the years I had come to see, teaching at small liberal arts colleges, that our current models for digital teaching, our current models for higher education simply can't scale to the demand of the world for higher education now. The liberal arts college model won't scale, the large university lecture hall won't scale, and in spite of the fact of having made most of my first career as a statement against online learning at small liberal arts colleges with low student faculty ratios, it seemed to me that the only way that we were going to meet the needs of global demand for education was through online learning. So it's been interesting over the last few years to see these arguments advanced. This one in particular by Newfield and Sublett, although there are any number of these that have cropped up over the last 6 months or a year. This one, does online reinforce the color line? Online education is an engine of racial inequality, is the bottom line here. And I pulled out 3 quotes that I want us to look at. The first 2 are questions, which I think are the questions, absolutely the questions that we are needing to be asking. Is online as good or better? We've probably all heard the no significant difference literature and argument, but this is the question. Is online as good or better relative to face-to-face? As good or better in a way that justifies using online courses to replace face-to-face instruction? I don't think there's any doubt these days that hybrid models of teaching and learning are probably a good thing, or at least probably a good thing for students that already have a foundation. But the question, I think, for scale is, can these online courses be used to replace face-to-face instruction? I realize that I'm preaching to the choir here, that you're probably here because you already believe in this. But I've come to realize we're not necessarily in the majority, certainly not in faculty across the United States, where I tend to interact mostly, and certainly not amongst the populace. Second question, and this is really what drives the title line here, is how does online learning impact success rates across racial groups? Now, the racial group or ethnic group, and I would argue also gender, also socioeconomic status, also a number of other indicators of historically disadvantaged groups. In the United States, it's the ethnicity or racial group category that tends to get focused on for inequality, because those things are so correlated with things like postal codes that don't tend to be represented very well in higher education. In particular, in California, where Newfield and Sublett are from, the backdrop of this article, by the way, is about Governor Brown's, the governor of California, wanting to put in, I believe it's a 125th community college in California that's purely online. There are a lot of arguments about that, but it looks like it's going to happen. This was at a time when that was still moving its way through the state congresses. But they're not pleased with this, because as they see it, online education is going to disadvantage those students in the community college who are already disadvantaged. And here's their conclusion. Online disadvantages African American and Latino students. Online education is currently an engine of racial inequality. No good higher ed policy can be created by ignoring that. So I want to consider online education as an engine of equity rather than an engine of inequity. I love the phrase den of inequity, give us a biblical proportion. And I want to advance this notion or ask this question by thinking about some things that I don't think often play into the arguments. They certainly did not play into the argument that Neufeld and Sublette were making. First of all, I think it's rarely considered that the demand for higher education vastly exceeds our ability to supply with traditional modes, face-to-face modes. And these modes cannot scale sufficiently. Digital teaching, on the other hand, is scalable. I love the back of the napkin work that our Dean and CEO, Phil Regier, has done, kind of modeling this out through the year 3030, suggesting, I think, in the end, we would have to build 5 universities the size of ASU per week, every week of the year between now and 2030, in order for those curves to meet. And of course, that simply cannot happen. A second thing that I think is neglected is the counterfactual. The counterfactual that's put out there, or the plausible alternative, is, well, we shouldn't use face-to-face education. We shouldn't use online education because it's inferior, because it hurts students who would otherwise be hurt. Those students should just go to face-to-face education. Given the demand for higher education and given the economic, at least in the United States, and I assume here in the UK as well, given the economic barriers to getting into higher education, the actual counterfactual is no education at all. Even if those two things weren't true, and this is where I really take issue with a lot of the empirical arguments that are out there against online education now, I think we've neglected to use proper methodology, and this is what I'll be talking about for the remainder as we look at our studies, studies that I think did engage some of the proper methods. But proper methods for evaluating the efficacy of online education must include the evaluation of online programs and not merely online courses. This is something that I've seen hardly any of at all. That is, comparison of a population of students that are embedded not just in online courses, but in online courses that are themselves embedded in support systems, layers of support that are optimized and unique to the online students, and not merely face-to-face students who happen to be somewhere else taking an online course. A second thing I think we need to consider is that in order for efficacy studies to actually be efficacy studies and not merely effectiveness studies, we need to be looking at the best of the online programs. Now, I know that sounds self-serving because I'm going to be showing you the data from ASU. I do think that ASU is one of the outstanding online programs right now, but I think there are a number of other really outstanding online programs around the world. We need to be looking at those programs. If we did an efficacy study on a drug, we would not look at the average effect of how that drug is used in all of its various ways. That would be an effectiveness study. Rather, what we would do, acknowledging that maybe we don't know how the drug works, that's why we're doing the efficacy study, we would look for very specific places where that drug has the best opportunity for making its impact. And then we'd ask, for whom does that drug work? We need to do the same thing with our online education. And that takes us to a third property of proper methodology, carefully modeling heterogeneous treatment effects. Are we carefully disaggregating our data for the populations of interest to be able to tell whether it's working for those students or not? And as I'll show you, that's not always an easy thing to do. In fact, it involves typically some time-consuming and sometimes difficult quasi-experimental methods that balance confounding variables. This is one of the main problems that we've run into, and I know that there are many folks in here that are careful methodologists. This is something that we would typically know we need to be careful of, but I see too little of it out in the literature. So let me share some results with you for the remainder of our time, the next 15 minutes or so. I'm going to skip the work in progress. I'll talk just about an online efficacy study, some gender and ethnicity, equity studies that we've done, and heterogeneous treatment effects in adaptive tutoring and college algebra. So the research question here is simply what does the online gap look like for ASU Online? Are there meaningful gaps in student success between face-to-face and online programs? Student success is a notoriously difficult variable to operationalize, of course. We jumped into this. This was our first large-scale study, and we did, I think, the responsible thing, which was to take fairly low-hanging fruit. We looked at grade-based measures within a course for student success. We are actively engaging in as many other measures of student success as we can, but today I'll be talking about grade-based measures. From 2010 to 2016, we looked at the records of 160,000 unique students. That's a little over 1 million student course observations. We looked at these in 252 of our courses across 70 different academic disciplines. You get to see the distribution of the courses there. Only 252 courses, because the approach that we took on this first study was to look at only the courses that had a large enough enrollment in both online and face-to-face to warrant a fairly complex logistic regression model within each course for each outcome. That meant that we had to have at least 500 or 600 students across those two populations for each course. So these are 252 of our largest courses where size is measured by both online and face-to-face enrollment. By the way, the reason for doing that, I'll show you the results of some other studies that don't disaggregate by course. The reason for doing that is we want our work to be actionable. We don't just want a number at the end of the day. We want to be able to guide our instructional designers to say, here's a course that's doing really well. Let's learn from that. Here's a course that's not doing particularly well. Let's fix that. I won't walk you through the details on this other than it's a logistic regression model. It's a common model across all the courses and outcomes. The outcomes are completion. Simply, did a student make it through to the end of the course without withdrawing, regardless of what grade they got? Binary variable. Second, given that they completed, so this is conditional passing, given that they completed, did they pass the course or not? And that passing grade was determined by their major course of study. Sometimes that's a D, sometimes that's a C. And then conditional mastery. Given that they passed the course, did they get a B or better? Did they master the material? Our primary predictor variable of interest is modality, face-to-face. We included a number of interaction terms to be able to look at efficacy across these other factors. And then our method of balancing, not a very sophisticated method, but subsequent studies have suggested to us that this was probably pretty close to sufficient. Simple covariate adjustment. We took all the variables that we could afford to put into the model, put those in, let them level the playing field by absorbing the variance, and then looked for the results of our predictor variables. And here are the results. This is predicted success rate. That's the average across the 252 courses, average predicted success from the model. In the gold is online, in the maroon is face-to-face or on campus. You can see for completion, you can see for all three variables, they're very close. Of course, we're not talking about MOOC completion rates here. These are, this is online courses for degree-seeking students. So actually, online outperformed just slightly the face-to-face in completion. That flipped, face-to-face outperforming online just slightly on passing, and on mastery statistically equivalent, largely because there's a lot of variance in there. To see that variance, I'll show you disaggregated by the 252 courses. Each of those bubbles is a course. The size of the bubble represents the online enrollment. And what I'm plotting here is the predicted average success rate for that course, that is the predicted success of the average ASU student in that course, for the online modality, for the face-to-face modality, for each of the three outcome variables. If there was parity, of course, these things would be distributed along the dashed line. If a course favored the online modality, that would be up in the upper left triangle. If it favored the online modality, that would be down in the lower right triangle. And as you can see, for completion, for all three variables, they relatively cluster around the line. For completion, that's largely up in the high range. For passing, also up in the high, although you can see those courses that are weighted towards face-to-face in the red. And for mastery, the story is really variability, as we would hope and expect for B or better mastery. As I said, the advantage here allows us to disaggregate by course. We can go all the way down to the level of the individual course, or we can group courses together. Here are the 61 STEM courses in the sample, and as you can see, those cluster pretty much in the way that the overall population does. In fact, we couldn't find any course grouping by college, by academic department, or by any other way of grouping courses that favored one modality over the other. The conclusion from this study really was largely, as we look at the aggregate, it seems to be that there is parity for these outcome measures. So it works. Does it work for everyone? The research question here is, does online undergraduate education disadvantage certain groups? In this study, we took a different approach. We put all of the students together, 4,900 courses, about 140,000 students between 2014 and 2018. And instead of doing covariate adjustment, we did something that's much better. Thanks. Something that's much better in terms of causal modeling, and that is to do inverse probability weighting. I'm showing you this plot so that you can see the imbalance for each of these variables, the difference between the two populations. And methodologically, this would be my main take-home point for today. This is a 200 standard deviation difference between the two groups on how many units per term they take. What we know about part-time students is they're much less likely to succeed than full-time students. So balancing even on that one variable would have a huge impact. After applying the inverse probability weighting, we get to the darker dots over here down near 0 standard deviation difference, where we're looking to get for balance. If we were to look only at the raw gap for each of these gender ethnicity pairs, what we would see is that although there's relative parity for males on average, black males seem to be doing much worse online than much worse online than face-to-face. A few of these are nearly null, mixed other a little bit better, that is online is favored. And for females, it looks much more grim. Each of the ethnicity gender pairings there are below the mean. The problem with that is that's the imbalanced version. If we balance, we get a much more accurate version of the causal effect of interest here. The difference in the performance across the modalities. And this shows a very different picture, and it guides our leadership and our instructional designers and faculty in a much different way. You can see here that each of the male groups are doing significantly better online than face-to-face, and for 3 of the female groups, 2 of them being statistically null. The same thing holds using that same method for graduation rates, the ASU Online graduation rates. I'm only showing you the adjusted gaps here, but range between 2 and 10% higher for online than for face-to-face. And again, this is for adjusted group comparisons. Finally, I'll walk you through heterogeneous treatment effects of adaptive tutoring. This is really my favorite of the studies. It's much smaller scale, it's much more focused, but I think it's a really pretty story. How effective is adaptive tutoring in increasing student success in college algebra? and is it equally effective for everyone? In 2016, the adaptive tutoring platform ALEX was adopted by all of our online and face-to-face courses for algebra. We partnered with the math faculty in the provost's office to help them leading up to this and following that so that we could do a quasi-experimental design. We didn't do A/B testing on this, as nice as that would have been. This is a little bit more ethical, rolling it out to everyone in this particular case. Again, huge pre-post imbalances that were able to be corrected with the inverse probability weighting. And the results were really dramatic. We saw about a half standard deviation treatment effect, so a pretty sizable treatment effect between before ALEX, here's the implementation of ALEX, and post-ALEX, the adaptive tutoring, for both low ability math students and high ability math students. A dramatic increase in the first year, and then very surprising to us when we got these data in, an equally dramatic increase in the second year, suggesting that these are the new students. They're not the same students that are now doing better and better. These are the faculty, we think, who are better able to make use of this digital tool. We see shifts in grade distribution. I won't walk you through the details on that. That difference between adaptive and traditional is nearly equal for all math ability levels, from the very lowest to the highest, suggesting that all students of all abilities are aided by this. And in terms of student demographics, all of the groups showed at least a 0.4 GPA increase in their scores from pre to post ALEX. Those aren't equal, right? You'll notice that female shows a slightly lower treatment effect than male, underrepresented minority than overrepresented, low socioeconomic compared to high, and when we cross those factors, it's what I've shown in red here, really the most vulnerable that are showing the lowest treatment effect. It's a lower treatment effect, but I want to point out that still everybody is advantaging for this, is advantaging from adaptive, even when we disaggregate by lower math ability, but these are starting to get quite low. The upshot of that is where there was no gap before between the best and the worst performing subgroups, a gap was introduced. So this is the bad news with the good news. The good news is that everybody increases. The bad news is where there was no gap now, a gap is introduced, which means sociologically, if we look generation after generation without fixing this, we're going to insert a problem rather than fixing it. A number of other outcomes, 24 percentage point increase in B or better grades, 12 percentage decrease in having to take multiple attempts, and some of my favorites looking at downstream effects. Students were more likely to switch to a major in STEM. Remember, these are students that came into the university without college algebra, so very unlikely that they would have switched to STEM in the first place, but they're more likely to switch to STEM. They're more likely to take a subsequent math course, a calculus course, and they perform equal to the students who were taking traditional. So good news for adaptive here. That is the end of my talk at time, I think. So thanks to a number of people, including Renee Kazilchech, my colleague who's now at Cornell, who helped us with a lot of that quasi-modeling. So thank you. And I would be happy to take questions, but probably during the break.
Take a couple.
Do we have time for one or two questions now? Yes, please.
You talked about the gap following the introduction of the ALEX adaptive support tool. How did you end up addressing it, or are you still addressing it?
We are still addressing it. What was really nice is to be able to take these data back to the math faculty and say, great job, and even better job in 2017, where you've learned to make use of this tool even better. But here's the bad news. You've got some students, the female underrepresented minority and female lower socioeconomic status that for some reason are not benefiting as much from this. And their response was, help us figure out what that was. We've got some social psych interventions that we are rolling out in other classes that we're now tailoring for that class. So hoping to work on some belongingness, some socio-emotional learning, non-cognitive factors to increase students' sense of belongingness there. Thank you.
Sorry if I missed this, and thanks. That was really, really interesting and
Thank
clear even to me. But one thing I missed was whether, in the end, after Alex, after the online intervention, was the relative position of the underrepresented poor females, was there more inequality or less inequality compared with the in-person face-to-face?
That's a great question. With respect to Alex, I did not show you those data. We had about 12,000 students in that sample, which is sizable, but it wasn't large enough for us to confidently answer the online versus face-to-face in that. So we combined online and face-to-face. Our very initial work suggested that the gap was somewhat moderated in online. That is, it didn't seem to be as big in online, which would make sense if you're not there to kind of expose your differentness in the same way in an online environment. That differentness wouldn't have the same social psych impact on you. So kind of an unusual situation where a little bit of anonymity might provide some buffering, but that's all entirely speculation. One more? Yep, thank you.
The comparisons between the online and the campus-based programs are really interesting. I guess that the next question would be, do, for example, employers or universities looking at postgraduate entry, do they see equal value in them? Because that could introduce an attainment gap.
Absolutely. We just finished an MTurk study, an Amazon Mechanical Turk study, asking workers around the world some questions about people and programs, online versus face-to-face. And we have just the very preliminary results of that. It seems that there is a stigma for online programs, but not necessarily so much of a stigma for people who went through online programs. We're hoping to roll that out a little bit more broadly than MTurk now and replicate it and actually get it published. But I think the question of, is online education stigmatized? Would there be a self-fulfilling prophecy effect even if the educational attainment were the same in these? Is an excellent question. Great, thanks very much. And I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.